I'm Josh.
And I'm Kalie.
And I'm Rafael Di Furia. Welcome back to another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. In this episode, I happened to see something on my feed earlier on YouTube. These days, less and less I find myself watching other expat creators on YouTube, although I do have a few that I do enjoy from time to time, including expats everywhere, friends of the channel. They've been on my channel, I've been on their channel, and podcasts. Anyway, it doesn't matter, neither here nor there. We've had some great experiences, both on camera and off camera, conversations talking about Portugal. And actually, there was a brief little conversation that we've had about Italy. And I know they've spent some time in Italy recently. And 11 days ago, at least 11 days before the recording of this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, they uploaded an episode on their YouTube channel, Expats Everywhere. Of course, I'll include a link to that below in the more info section if you're watching this on YouTube, on the description, or if you're watching this as a video podcast on Spotify or listening to this on any of the other podcasting platforms. But it's called, Is Living in Italy Really Better Than Portugal? And of course, for those of you who know me, I've spent time in both of these countries. I really do have a love in my heart for both of these places, and in different ways. And actually, this kind of fits in with a comment that recently came in on my YouTube channel from YouTube user John. Do you prefer living in Portugal over Italy? And it's tough to say, because there are certain things I like more about one place and more about the other place. And there are things that I think really align more with who I am in one place than the other. And there's certain things that are more convenient in one place than the other. But let's go and see, not just through my own experiences, because I've spoken about it plenty on this channel, but let's hear what Josh and Kalie have to say and go through some of their opinions. And I'll be commenting along the way. And for the sake of the length of this episode, I'm going to be watching this at 1.5 times speed, just so that this doesn't get too long. But anyway, let's roll.
We've been living in Portugal for 3 years now, and we just got back from a 7-week trip in Italy, and we've had several visits to Italy in the past as well. We love Italy. Is it time to consider moving there? Let's talk about Portugal versus Italy. I'm Josh.
And I'm Kalie. And number one on the list is cost of living.
I'm just going to pause it right here. Cost of living is something that goes back and forth. Personally, my opinion that I'm going to share before watching what they have to say here is that there are certain factors about living in Portugal which I do find less expensive, and there are certain factors about living in Italy that I find less expensive, especially if we're talking about food products, and specifically Italian food products like Barilla products. Okay, I know a lot of people are not such big fans of Barilla, but something that I could get for a couple of euros and then seeing it in the supermarket here for like 5 or 6 euros. Yeah, that's something that, just like you have your normal things that you run to in the supermarket that aren't necessarily the best, but you're going to grab them just anyway because you know it's easy and dependable. But anyway, back to it.
Cost of living is an interesting thing, because if you go on a website like Numbeo, you're going to see that prices are fairly similar, but Italy is more expensive than Portugal. I don't know if I find that in reality actually being there.
Oh, I think it is. I think that Italy used to be known as a more affordable option in Europe and in the EU, but I think that prices have definitely risen. Now, maybe when you talk about housing, right now, obviously Portugal housing is really high, but on a day-to-day cost of living, like going out to restaurants and the cost of maybe a glass of wine or a beer or a meal, I think you can definitely tell the difference, even if you do the local food, like the local cuisine.
Yeah, that's actually, Kalie just raised a really great point. So there are certain things, like I said, I think for me, just my personal opinion when it comes to apartments, it used to maybe be a little bit different than it might be now. I would have said in the past that cost of renting an apartment and having a home in Italy might have been more in the past. Now, I think things are getting to be pretty close to on par, if not like slightly more in some cases here in Portugal, especially for some cities. It just depends on where you are and kind of what you're comparing to, because there's different tiers of how large cities are, what they have available, the amenities that they have available to them. But even like for food specifically, again, talking about going out for an evening out, the amount of money that I would spend for going out for an evening with friends to dinner or whatever, it might be double or triple of the price that I've paid in Portugal for the same. I mean, for example, not long after moving to Portugal, I spoke with a good friend of mine, Mr. Marco Permunian from ItalianCitizenshipassistance.com, who I do the Italian citizenship and real estate podcasts with. And I ended up mentioning to him that I took a family member out for a meal, and the amount that the cost was he was like, oh my gosh, wow, like that's so great per person. And I was like, no, that was the price for 2 people, not 1 person. So that was the thing that was actually the most shocking to me here in Italy, is that the prices could be that different. Fine, you can pay the same prices on par, but there have been more instances where I have paid maybe half of the price of what I would have paid in Italy. But let's continue on yet again.
Right. One of the big things that I did notice with different costs would be in taxis. Taxis are so expensive in Italy compared to Portugal.
I think that's definitely something to consider because taxis or Uber, Bolt, those types of ride shares is still very, very affordable in Portugal. And it's not so much in Italy. And that goes for all different cities around Italy.
No, not at all. We actually took a taxi from our hotel, which was about a 20-minute ride to the train station in Turin. And it cost us 25 euros, I believe it was, thereabouts. And we had to use cash.
Oh, yes.
Like so many places or so many taxis that we ended up having to take, we had to use cash.
Their card machine wasn't working, right?
Their card machine wasn't working. Whereas in Portugal, it's pretty easy just to book something through an app like Uber or like Bolt, and you're good to go.
It's a lot more affordable. But I would say this, that rideshare apps are a little different in Italy as well compared to in Portugal. So maybe you could book something through Uber, but an actual taxi would come because of the little fight that they have going on.
Yes.
And it might actually be more expensive through Uber as opposed if you just go through a taxi. But one thing you do have is the security of like a set rate with Uber as opposed to not knowing if your taxi driver is taking you the long way.
So that's actually an experience that I personally haven't had in Italy. I didn't live in areas where Ubers were available and rideshares apps were available. But I know, generally speaking, that the taxis in Italy can be quite pricey, especially if you do call them on the phone. Like, I remember there was even one city that I visited, and if you called the taxi, you had to pay the fee for them to come and pick you up. And just that was like the entry fee to get into the taxi. And then from there, you had a separate fee for the actual cost of the ride itself, and overall definitely a lot more expensive. And this was years and years ago than what you would pay even for an Uber or a Bolt now. But also, from what I understand, those apps, Uber and Bolt, if you want to just have anybody be able to drive in Italy, as far as I'm aware, that's not actually legal. I believe at one point these rideshare apps were actually banned. From what they're saying now, it sounds like maybe they're back. It's been a couple of years since I've been back in Italy, but it's really interesting to hear their experience because, yeah, I definitely would say getting around Italy is often more expensive in a local sense, unless you're taking like local transportation. Like if you're in some of the cities, they have like metros or buses that are actually somewhat decent.
Okay, so the winner for the cost of living is pretty clear. I think the people have spoken on Numbio, and it would be Portugal.
Yes.
All right.
Next.
I'm just going to say one thing because they did reference Numbio. I'm personally not the biggest fan of the website. It is worthwhile looking at. I found plenty of examples where Numbio's information was either outdated or something that just didn't reflect what I saw in person. So while you could use it as something that leads you in a certain direction, I wouldn't put too much weight into the results that you get there. And so personally, I would say take Numbio's numbers with a grain of salt, always.
Next. Number 2 is safety, a very important one.
Yeah. So safety, when you're looking at safety ratings globally, whether it be on a site like Numbio, which is aggregated from people putting stuff into the database.
Like it depends on who goes on there and adds the data,
Sure.
right? As opposed to
Deeper research being done.
right. So those types of statistics. So, but if you look at both of those, Portugal is the clear winner there.
Yeah, I think with a site like Numbio, you're looking more at personal safety, personal security, whereas Global Peace Index is looking also in terms of a country's geopolitical stance on things. So being there, feeling it, we never have to worry about pickpocketing here in Portugal. Not to say that you shouldn't be mindful of it, but it's not really a concern that I think many foreigners will tell you to watch out for. But in Italy, it is kind of a known thing.
That's the biggest one to look out for. So when we talk about safety as well, it's not necessarily violent crimes. I would say that Italy overall feels comfortable in that sense.
Definitely.
Maybe depending on what city you're in and what hour of the day it is important to take into consideration. Whereas I think in Portugal, you could be out even in Porto or Lisbon later at night. And as far as like violent crimes, you don't have to worry about that. But the big...
So I'm just going to pause this right here. And I'm not going to completely disagree with what they were saying about these types of violent crimes and so on. Generally speaking, I do feel safer in Portugal than I have in Italy. There are places that I've even been in small towns where I feel safer in certain larger cities here in Portugal. And I'm not going to say that, oh, you can just walk around any city in the middle of the night and be completely safe. Things happen. When it comes to violent crime, I mean, actually, it's funny that just on the side of this video, there does happen to be this this thumbnail for Dave in Portugal about talking about how he was mugged in Portugal, and that was a violent crime situation. I would say those tend to be more in the minority of situations here. Also in Italy, I would say those also are in the minority of situations. However, I do hear about violent crimes in both places, but where do I hear about them more? I can't say for sure. Maybe I've heard more stories over the years in Italy, but the thing is, it's a much larger country in general. So is it fair to really compare like the amount that I've heard about? It's overall a very tough subject. And so I would say even if both of these places generally lean towards being very safe, nowhere is ever 1,000,000% perfect. So if you're thinking that something is impossible, I would say don't necessarily go that far to think that everything will always be perfect and can only ever be perfect. But generally speaking, when we are talking about these places, they do have a tendency to be safer than some other parts of the world, especially these days, and even the country that I originally came from. But let's continue yet again.
Okay, so next up is food. This one is going to be contentious, especially among our Portuguese audience. So I think most people internationally know Italian food. Italian food is pretty deeply ingrained in most Americans' kind of food culture, right?
Yes. I mean, and when we think about Italian food, generally it's pasta and pizza.
Chef Boyardee and DiGiorno.
But there is a lot more to Italian food than that. But
Absolutely.
They do
Great
pasta
pasta.
and pizza really well.
But I would say it is different.
Ooh,
The type of pasta that you're used to, the pasta dishes that you're used to in the US, they will taste different in Italy, for sure.
Yeah, but better. I mean, like, you go to a place that it's fresh, right? Especially if you go to a place where they're hand making it in front of you. But Italian food is definitely more complex. It has a lot more than just pasta and pizza, but those are also really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing actually that is a really good point, that people think that just food in Italy is just pizza and pasta. And okay, a lot of it can be, at least pasta. I mean, if you go into an Italian pantry and see all the different types of pasta, well, this one's for this type of sauce and this one's for this type of sauce. And it's not uncommon to maybe have pasta at least a couple times a week or a few times a week, or even some people have it every day or sometimes even a couple of times a day, because especially when you're buying dry pasta, it ends up being really easy to cook. And then there's so many decent pre-made sauces, or that you can even, if you go to just the regular supermarket, or even if you go to a gourmet shop, that you can get really good pre-made sauces that are not that crazy in price. So sometimes it even ends up being more worth it to be able to just go to the store rather than make it on your own, even though some of these things at the end of the day can actually be quite easy to make.
What about Portuguese food?
So Portuguese food has a ton of variety as well, definitely lesser known. I would say actually Portuguese pastries might be a little, well, the pastel de nata would probably be the most famous thing that's kind of been sent abroad.
Well, the pastries. I mean, if you want to talk about desserts, although Italy does have good desserts as well, but I mean,
Yeah, I'm going to stop this one here as well, because I think I've said this in episodes before, but I almost kind of prefer Portuguese pastry sometimes. It's crazy though. And it's not just because of the price. Price definitely plays a small factor in it, but I feel like for what I could buy here in Portugal for, say, €6 to be enough for me and maybe a couple of other people, in Italy, I could have easily paid 15 to 20 euros for the same amount of cookies or little small cakes or little coffee, whatever it is. That was the first thing that when I came to Portugal was really, really shocking to me, how inexpensive some of those things would be. Yeah, sometimes going to the bakery in Italy, especially like a more decent bakery that had like nicer options available that were handmade and good quality, they definitely weren't cheap. My experience though in Italy was that there were a lot more pastries that had like cream in them, like whipped cream or some type of kind of dairy cream base, whereas in Portugal a lot of things are like an egg custard cream kind of base. So that is one thing that I do miss from Italy actually, because sometimes there's only so much egg custard cream that I can take. I like it, but there's a lot of it here.
I mean, like Portugal knows how to do their pastries. I would say this, a lot of them are egg-based, right?
Yes, it's an allergy.
Because of their history. So there is that to consider, but they do pastries really well.
I also want to say with Portuguese food, like a pretty standard meal experience in a Portuguese restaurant would be going in and having some sort of meat with a rice, with a potato, and with bread served.
And maybe
So-
a itty bitty salad.
And salad,
Or just
lettuce, maybe some sliced onion.
And tomato.
Yeah, a little bit of vinegar and all.
Yeah, that's
It's a
exactly
bit of an
there.
afterthought, but it's there.
It's there. So those are your veggies.
Yeah.
There are vegetable dishes in Portugal, but if you're talking about like the average experience going to a restaurant and just kind of choosing thing at random off the menu, that's probably what your dish is going to look like.
Yeah, and maybe soup as a starter. That's big. Yeah, like a vegetable soup. Okay.
Whereas in Italy,
Yeah. Oh gosh, you got the
you've
different.
got the antipasti, the primeri platti, the secondi platti, the desserts.
And I don't know who eats all of that.
Who does eat all that?
It's a
Italians eat all that. Yes, I have been to those meals with Italians, and it's like, yes, well, we're getting this for the primo, this for the secondo. I'm like, okay, cool. And I'm thinking, we're in Europe, we're in Italy, they're going to be smaller portions, and so of course it's going to be easy to get through the whole meal. But no, people complain about how large American portions can be and how much Americans eat, but when you take into all of these different piatti and like all the courses throughout the meal, it's a lot of food, especially if you go to like a family style restaurant where you kind of share the food. Oh, it's a lot of food.
So this one's not difficult for me. However, I think it could be difficult for some people, but the clear winner is Italy.
Yeah.
Ooh, I know I'm about to actually make some people probably quite angry. And I think I've said this on camera before, so I hate to say it, but there are times when I actually do prefer going out to eat in Portugal rather than Italy. I know, shocker, horrifying. It is truly blasphemous. I understand. But the reason why I often prefer dining in Portugal is because there are more dishes that I personally find that revolve around a protein, rather than in Italy. There are many, many dishes that seem to revolve around a starch. It's not a bad thing, but I prefer to have a more protein-heavy diet than a starch and like pasta kind of heavy diet. I don't eat pasta all that often. There was a point growing up, we ate basically Italian all the time. That was all we ate. Like, even I remember as a kid asking, like, I was given a choice, like, to choose the restaurant that we were going to go to for the family, that we were going to go out. And I was like, hey, can we go eat Italian food? My mother looked over at me. She's like, no, how dare you even think of such a thing? It was like such a big offense to my own Italian mother that I could even mention the idea of going to an Italian restaurant, because if you want to eat Italian, we eat Italian at home. We don't go out to eat Italian. You want Italian, you eat it here. So, yeah, there was a time that was all that I ate, and pasta definitely every day for a long portion of my life. But now as an adult, I don't eat it that much, and I don't eat a lot of bread as well. And maybe in Italy, I'm trying to think where you even eat more bread. And I guess maybe it's just done differently, the different types of breads. And that's actually one thing I do sometimes miss from Italy, are the different breads. Although here in Portugal, I've definitely had better baguettes than I've had in Italy. I had a hard time finding baguettes in Italy. I mean, not that you can't find them, but maybe it was just my personal experience there.
Okay, I didn't know we differ on that.
Love Italian food. Love Italian food. Okay, next up, number 4, let's talk about the cities and just kind of the depth of options that we have comparing Portugal and Italy.
Yes. So, I mean, in Portugal, you have Lisbon as the capital, Rome being the capital of Italy. Very different cities, size-wise, for sure. Yeah. So those are the capitals. And then if you go to like maybe the second largest city in Portugal, it would be Porto. Whereas in Italy, you have a lot of options that are quite close in how big they are. So once we start scaling down size-wise, Italy has way more big cities than Portugal does.
Yeah, I think that what you see...
Just to pause it there again, I think in general, Italy has a lot more of everything. It's a much bigger country with many more people and a lot more types of landscape and cities and what you can find in those cities. So yeah, that's kind of, I was kind of saying that earlier in the video. There are certain things that are tough to compare between Portugal and Italy, just because of the size difference in general and the population difference in general. But when it comes to the variety of things that you can find in Italy, there's definitely a much wider variety that you can find over there.
Is in Italy, you have a wide variety of cities and like larger cities that will be full of amenities and options.
But no, it's true that you do have a wider range of these things anyway.
Things available to you, whether it's art, culture, sports, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Portugal, the scale drops quite a bit. Now, if you're the type of person that wants a city, then you might want to lean towards Italy in this fact. But if you're a person that wants like the village or town life, you have that in both.
You do have that in both. Yeah, they'll have a bit of a different feel, but you definitely have that in both. But...
And the good thing is about if you are going to spend time in a city or in a village, that if you do want to get out of the city, you can go to the villages quite easily. And if you are living in a village, you can go to the cities quite easily. I mean, especially if you're in a smaller area, like, or outside of a smaller city, you can be in a small village outside of Bologna, for example, and have the country life, but then be in Bologna in like 20 minutes. Or you can be on Lago di Garda and be in Verona really quickly, or you can be outside of Naples and get to Naples quite easily, especially when we're talking about like public transport and stuff like that. Then that's one area that, in my personal opinion, Italy really does shine. And you can't really compare the train system in Portugal to the train system in Italy. Again, we are talking about more things and wider varieties and just a bigger country in general, but the Italian train system, even for all of the problems that it has and the delays and things, it's a pretty robust system.
So it depends on what you're looking for as far as cities, but let's move on to language.
Yeah, so with language, it's very interesting because we're looking at this from kind of two ways and both with English speakers in mind, okay? So our audience is English speakers, we're speaking in English. So we need to look at how does an English speaker adapt to Portuguese and Italian, and then also how English friendly are these countries as you're trying to adapt to their language?
Yeah, as far as language goes, like the actual language, to talk about the Portuguese language and Italian language, I think they're quite comparable in how easy or difficult they are. You know, it depends on the learner for sure.
Comparable.
But the base is the same.
Wow.
Yes. So I think that as far as learning the language, it would be quite similar.
Yeah, learning it from like a textbook for sure. Speaking it on the street, I think it'd be a bit different because the pronunciation in Portugal is notoriously more difficult.
Yes, it is much more difficult, generally speaking. It also depends on where in the country you are, especially if you're in the north of the country. Even native Portuguese speakers from other countries do at times find difficulties with not only understanding, but maybe even trying to recreate the pronunciation and the accent. Italian, in some ways, maybe to me, some parts of it are a little bit easier. I would say it's tough because also when I'm thinking about Portuguese, I'm also thinking about European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese. And for me, Brazilian Portuguese as a native English speaker generally ends up being much easier to jump into, at least when we're talking about the grammar, although there are certain parts of the language which the way that Brazilians speak ends up being a little bit more confusing for me, rather than how they phrase it in Portugal. But if we're talking about European Portuguese, even though there are certain aspects of the language with how they phrase things and the verbs and the conjugation here, maybe if we're comparing European Portuguese to Italian, maybe Italian would be a little bit easier. But for me, I do find in some ways that I end up slipping into Portuguese a little bit easier. And I didn't grow up speaking the language, but for whatever reason, Portuguese comes easier to me than Italian. And I have enough Italian that I can get around. At least I've been losing my Italian, not living there, but I still have some that I can get around with. And every once in a while, I look for those opportunities when I can practice a little bit. But overall, yeah, if you're looking to actually learn the language of the country, for many native English speakers, I know they have a preference for Italian and the way that it sounds. European Portuguese can be a bit heavy and guttural at times in comparison and have certain sounds that are much more difficult to reproduce for a native English speaker, at least. Brazilian Portuguese, again, it's not that you can say that you learn Brazilian Portuguese and then you can move to Portugal and use it here. I'd actually advise against that. Unless Brazilian Portuguese is at a really high level, then okay, you can make that transition into life in Portugal and understand what people are saying. There will be some things that you have to learn and change and figure out what they mean sometimes. But if you're learning it for the first time, learn the language of the country, not the one that's easier.
And then what about actual use out on the street? If you're trying to learn Italian and then you're using that out on the street compared to if you're learning Portuguese and using that out on the street, like which do you think is easier?
They're pretty similar. I think where Portuguese gets the win is actually among the people, because Portuguese people are super patient when it comes to people trying to speak their language, and they're also accommodating. So if they see that you're struggling or hear that you're struggling, they'll switch to English.
Yeah, so that's actually that detail though about switching to English, that's the one thing that can make things sometimes a little bit more complicated if you are trying to learn the language out on the street. If they detect an accent and you're like really getting excited that you're able to finally start using some of your Portuguese, that's when at least I start getting a little bit frustrated from time to time in comparison with living in Italy. However, overall, when it does get to those moments when maybe I do not have a certain part of the language, it ends up being really useful to be able to kind of fall back on English here in Portugal, because even I've been in smaller towns and villages than maybe some of the places that I've been in Italy, and I've had more luck in Portugal with maybe somebody speaking English if I really was struggling. But nowadays with Google Translate or even DeepL, whatever that AI translator is, these days it ends up being a lot easier than maybe how it used to be in the past. But I do personally find, though, generally speaking, that I've encountered more English speakers across the board in Portugal than I have in Italy. And that's just been my experience.
But what about the local speaking English and how well that goes?
Yeah, so statistically, Portuguese would have the advantage over Italians when it comes to the amount of people in Portugal and their level of fluency. They're one of the highest in the world. Okay. In saying that, we didn't have very many difficulties at all speaking in.
I would say, yeah, definitely here in Portugal that the proficiency level seems to be much higher here than in Italy. Just, again, personal experience. But it's interesting that it seems as though it is reflected in some form of measurement.
Okay, next up, let's talk about healthcare. right? We have far more experience with Portuguese healthcare than we do Italian healthcare. In terms of functionality, there are problems within the Portuguese healthcare system. Sometimes it gets overloaded.
The public
system gets overloaded, but the same thing happens in Italy.
Right. And, actual personal experience in Italy, what we see, what we read. But if we go to statistics and we look at what is being said about the different healthcare systems, I think because of that, Italy.
This is interesting because I've had experience with both systems. Maybe I've had more experience with the Italian system than I have the Portuguese system. But this one's actually a toss-up for me personally. They gave it to Italy, but I think there are certain things that are more convenient about the Italian system. But I think there are certain things about the quality of service and quality of care in Portugal that might push it forward a bit. Like, for example, in Italy, if you go to your family doctor, your GP, your general practitioner, at least before 2020, there were a lot of doctors with walk-in services. From what I've been hearing now, more and more you're having to make an appointment ahead of time. And at least from what I've been gathering, still getting an appointment there is not that big of a deal. And it may be a week, a couple of days, a few weeks. But here in Portugal, as I've mentioned in another episode, that I had waited for like 3 months for a doctor's appointment last year. And literally the night before that, my doctor ended up being sick. And they said, oh, you're going to get a call next year for your appointment. And it is already, February 15th. And I've yet to hear about rescheduling my appointment from last year. So yeah, that's a thing. And even getting the appointments in general has taken a long time. I mean, each time that I've had to make an appointment, it was scheduled like 3+ months out in advance. So yeah, this is a bit frustrating when it comes to at least dealing with the Portuguese public system. I've heard that there are certain aspects of the Portuguese private system that are similar, and trying to get an appointment can be similar in that regard. But again, for me, it's a toss-up between the two, because one of the reasons why I actually would say that Portugal has an advantage is because when you do go to, say, your family doctor, general practitioner, that the level of care, that you're maybe given a little bit more attention than the experiences that I've had in Italy. I mean, I've had experiences even in Italy where doctors didn't look up from their computer screens and they said, okay, what hurts? What do you need? What do you want? Get out. But in Portugal, I've had the experience where the doctor was just like, oh, no, here, go, take this test, take that test, do this, do that. We have to make sure, I'm very concerned about you. You have to make sure you get this and that and the other taken care of. Whereas in Italy, it's like, maybe they didn't even shake your hand, let alone even maybe take your blood pressure or listen to your heartbeat or look you in the eye at times. Granted that this is a horrible generalization about my experiences in Italy, but I know other people who've had those similar experiences in Italy as well, and even for just a general checkup, that they weren't able to get those, but that's neither here nor there.
With the win. Okay, 8. Infrastructure. This one is an important one, because in infrastructure, we're looking at like the quality of building, roads, airports, water, like safe water,
Drinking water.
that type of stuff.
You think about roads in Italy, they've known how to do roads for quite a while, haven't they? But infrastructure-wise, I think because there are larger cities in Italy, they have maybe renovated and built up and restored a lot more than what's happened in Portugal.
So I can't help but wonder if during the times of Mussolini, there was a lot really built up during that time. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with it. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, I would say if we're talking about like highways in both countries, highways in Italy, generally speaking, if we're talking about like the main privately owned highways like the Autostrada, or even the main highway here in Portugal, Via Verde, I guess is what it's called. Or is that the fee-taking system? Whatever, it doesn't matter. But the highway here in Portugal, generally speaking, they're actually pretty comparable in my experience. Although the one thing that Italy really does push ahead with are the autogrill. That's something special right there. The Italian gas stations, the food is so good. I mean, you can get like a decent meal at these places, even everything. Imagine. And there's some that specialize in one thing or they specialize in another thing. I haven't really seen these in Portugal. Yeah, they have gas stations where you can stop and get a little snack, but definitely not like in Italy. I've seen something like this, what I'm talking about, in Spain, but I don't know if it's the norm there. But this is something where Italy I do miss from time to time.
Portugal's has very modern aspects to it, in terms of infrastructure, for sure. I think the Portuguese bus network is better, but the Italian network, because the country's bigger.
Trains. Oh, the
train network is bigger.
Yeah.
There's more variety. Get you more places. Portugal tends to be just really on the coast, up and down the coast.
Yeah.
And then
in Algarve, you have, the west to east one, but it's just one, right?
But trains tend to be more on time unless there's a strike in Portugal. Trains tend to be more on time here.
I don't know. They were quite efficient and on time in Italy.
This trip.
This trip. That's true.
I feel as though I've had more luck in Portugal with trains being on time than I have in Italy. But that also could be because there are a lot of trains in Italy that come from other countries such as Austria, Germany, Switzerland, France. So there are going to be times where if you're taking a regional train, you could have delays and maybe not, but your train could be dependent on another train coming from another part of the continent. But in Portugal, generally speaking, the trains here are all really, I think, domestic. There are some trains that go into Spain, but yeah, they're like they were saying in Portugal, it's kind of like the main kind of lines along the coast, and in the Algarve, you do have some that go into the interior of the country. Like, for example, here in Braga, we do have a train that goes directly to Porto, to Lisbon, and it maybe goes to the Algarve also, but I'm not entirely sure about that.
Bad experiences with trains.
Well, we've also had bad experiences in Portugal because of the strikes, which could come at any time, and you don't know your train is canceled until you get there.
Okay.
To be fair, I would say the same can go in Italy, although the strikes in both countries generally tend to be scheduled ahead of time. That's the one thing that actually can be, I'm not going to say convenient because it's definitely a big inconvenience, but so it can give you something to plan around and so that you can make some alternative arrangements if possible.
Next up, quality of life. Based on quality of life indexes, Portugal is better. Portugal has better air quality as well, which affects quality of life compared to.
And that's actually a really good point. It's something I don't really talk about on this YouTube channel enough. Air quality in Italy, there were plenty of days when it was just, the sky was just milky and unpleasant. Here in Portugal, I feel like I see the blue skies. I see the clouds and that I'm not looking up at milk above me. Maybe it depends on what part of Italy that you're in, but once you kind of get past Portugal, I guess maybe Spain and over south of the Alps, there's just this smog that hangs over southern Europe. And if you fly over the continent, you maybe have seen this at some point, but it's really unfortunate. Like there were days in Italy where the air quality was really, really not so great. And it's sad to say, but during the events of 2020, the sky and the air really cleared up. It was beautiful. The one time when everything was clear and you want to be outside and experience the fresh air, you couldn't. But I think because the winds carry just fresh air over the ocean, that even there are days I'm here in Braga, in the interior of the country, well, not interior, but I'm inland a bit, and I still feel like I've got this fresh sea breeze some days. Like, it's really a strange experience that I'm standing on the central square here, and it's like this gust of wind comes in. It's like, wow, what a refreshing breath of fresh air. And quite literally, not just figuratively.
And I mean, it's ranking like 20 positions higher when it comes to global quality of life, global pollution.
Yeah, because the north of Italy can get really bad with pollution and air quality.
And we experienced that. Like we experienced kind of some, not just difficulty breathing. It wasn't difficulty breathing, but you could feel it when you're breathing. You could taste it when you're breathing. Mm-hmm. Haven't really experienced that here in Portugal. I'm sure there are some places you could go.
The only time I think you really get that is when there are fires, which the fires happen a bit more in the interior. If you're closer to those, or if the wind blows it closer to the coast, which isn't super common but could happen, then it could affect the air quality. But that is kind of situational. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I guess the others are as well because of the factory stuff, but that's something that's like long term. This is like a fire happens and then it causes the pollution, the bad air quality. But what's happening in the north has a lot to do with factories and such. So that's kind of a long term thing. Yeah,
it is. Quality of life is a tricky one as well, because when you're looking at an index, the index often is really set to kind of the local standard quality of life. Whereas when you're talking about a foreigner, especially like a foreigner that's making more money than a local or having more economic resources, then the quality of life dynamic shifts, right?
Sure, yeah.
So I would say it pushes it even further in the direction of Portugal, because your money goes further here in Portugal versus in Italy. Mm-hmm. Your options in terms of geography, it also is probably better here than in Italy.
Okay.
Your days of sunshine, the societal stuff that we talked about, so kind of all of that put together, the winner is Portugal. Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to disagree, but I'm just going to say that I think also when you're talking about Italy, you have to take into account that the north can be very different from the south. And some of the things that you can experience in Portugal from north to south can be seen in some regards in the south of Italy when we're talking about especially the cost of things and cost of living. That may line up a little bit better with Portugal, but you're also going to see infrastructure and quality of roads change drastically from what you would experience in the north. I mean, from, like I've mentioned a number of times, my trip that I took to Sicily a number of years back, that there was potholes in the highway, and there was, like in Palermo, there was one main, I guess, highway, you could call it, street, long road that felt like a dirt road in a city, and I was a bit surprised about that. And even like when you went out to the countryside, there was parts of the highway that were like, it was like a meter difference between one side of the road and the other, because one side had sunk down and the other had just stayed up. And it wasn't meant to be like that. The road had just cracked and fallen. So even though the roads in both countries can be good, I might actually give that little bit of an edge to Portugal. But when we're talking about some of the quality of life things, there are certain aspects of the quality of life that I would say in Italy can be higher, but maybe overall things in Portugal can have a tendency to be a little bit more laid back. And that's something that I enjoy more about life here. I know, like, that may sound surprising that life in Italy less laid back. I mean, Italians are so laid back. Yeah, Italians can be laid back in some aspects, and some aspects maybe not so much. But generally speaking, my experience of Portugal has definitely been that when we're talking about quality of life, I think it's not just the practical aspects, but also the impractical aspects, your emotional attachments, and how you live your day-to-day life. Yeah. I might give it to Portugal as well in this case as well, but again, it's so close in my opinion that it could go one way or the other depending on what aspect you're talking about.
Moving on, number 10 is climate and weather. An important one, I think, for a lot of people, because some people are trying to escape the snow or the cold, or they're actually trying to get away from the heat. So depending on what you're looking for, you do have a variety in both. Yeah. Probably more of a variety in Italy, right? Because when you get up to the really northern parts, you do get snow.
Yeah. So both of them fall into that category. But I think, like you said, there's big variety when it comes to both places. And Portugal being so small and having all this variety is pretty remarkable. Mm-hmm. You can have snow in the winter. You can also have that in Italy.
Right.
I would definitely agree with that. But to me personally, I feel as though, having lived in Italy, that there is a bit more variety than there is here in Portugal. If we're talking about having snow here in Portugal, it's kind of relegated to certain areas where, okay, granted, in Italy, it's also kind of relegated to certain areas as well, but you can have snow in the north, center, and even in Sicily, and even have places where you can go skiing. So in Portugal, if you want to be able to go skiing, Serra da Estrela, is that the only place? I'm not sure if there are other places as well, but that's the only place that I can think of off the top of my head that would have it. But just like how the north of Portugal can have a tendency to be a bit more on the cloudy and rainy side, the north of Italy can as well. So you do have a lot of similarities, but I would say, again, it's largely due to Italy being a much larger country that you have more of options of where you can go. And in that regard, because of how many different choices you have, Italy might kind of be the winner, at least in that regard for me. But in Portugal, because of the air quality, I would enjoy the weather more, to be out and about, enjoying all kinds of weather. So from that regard, then that would push it back over to Portugal for me.
I think Italy's got a bit more variety because it is bigger. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Longer, right? I mean, it covers more like north to south.
Yeah, I think statistically, if we're looking at like warmer weather, you're going to find more warm weather spots in Portugal versus Italy. So if that's something that you're looking for. So if you're wanting more cold, Italy will have it. If you're wanting more warm, Portugal will have it.
Yeah, both quite temperate though in a lot of the cities, and a lot of coast too. But that's something to consider. So you've got Portugal, who most, is the Atlantic, right? In Italy, most is the Mediterranean. So as far as water goes, I think that water wins for Italy because it's much warmer, right? So if you want to get into the warmth of the water, so if you want to actually get into the water, it's really difficult. It's cold in Portugal because of the Atlantic, as opposed to warmer and calmer water that happens in more places of Italy. So beach stuff to consider.
So actually, that's one thing that's a great point to think about. If you're a surfer, Portugal, from what I've heard, is a much better option than in Italy. People tend to enjoy it more here than going to Italy, from what I've heard. I'm not a surfer, so I don't know, but I know that there are many more surfers that come, generally speaking, to Portugal rather than to Italy.
11, this is a very important one that you need to take into consideration before moving to a place. Like, don't think about this after moving, and that's tax obligations.
It's not a fun one to talk about, but it is important
To the end.
to the end.
Well, that's where I'm going to sign this video off. I think that's gotten deep enough in this episode. If you want to see more what they have to say about taxes, and I've cut out some other parts of their episode, so if you want to see the full episode, be sure to check out that link in the more info section down below or the description of this episode. Thank you to Josh and Kalie for being so gracious as to being okay with me to react to their episode. I checked in with them before recording this. So, hey guys, hope all is well. And if you have not seen their episode, be sure to go check out the full episode and let them know that Rafael from Not Your Average Globetrotter sent you, and send them my best. But also thank you to those of you who came to check out this episode, and an even bigger thank you to those of you who helped this project to be able to move forward on a monthly basis through Patreon or the one-time donations such as the thanks button here on YouTube or rafaeldifuria.com/support. All of your help to be able to push this project forward is greatly appreciated. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.